The Greyhound let Wren Hollis off at the corner of Route 421 and Cutter's Mill Road at 5 minutes past 5 on the afternoon of October 3rd, 2023. The sky above Harlan County was the color of a bruise healing wrong purple at the edges and yellow, where the sun was giving up behind the ridge. She stood on the gravel shoulder with a canvas duffel that had belonged to her grandfather and a long-handled shovel across her shoulder because it had not fit inside the bag. The shovel was a razorback hickory handle, the kind Cecil Hollis had bought at the hardware store in Cumberland in 1987, according to the price sticker still half-peeled on the shaft. She knew this because she had read the sticker 3 times on the bus ride from Lexington, the way a person reads something small and certain when everything large and uncertain is pressing in from all sides. Nobody was waiting for her. The lawyer in Harlan, a man named Preston Gall of Gall and Morrow on Pine Street, had written to her twice in September. The second letter said someone from the county would meet her at the stop and drive her the 6 miles out to the property. The gravel shoulder was empty, except for a crow picking at something flat in the road, and a rusted mile marker that said 14 in faded green. She waited 31 minutes. The crow finished its business and left. Wren picked up the duffel and started walking north on 421, with the shovel across her shoulder and the wind coming down off Black Mountain, smelling of wet limestone and wood smoke and something sweeter. Underneath that she would later learn was the ironweed her grandfather had let spread across the south pasture since 1974, because he said the monarchs needed it more than he needed a clean field. She was 17 years old. She weighed 108 pounds. She had $380 folded into the inside pocket of her grandfather's barn coat, a Carhartt duck canvas in brown that was 4 sizes too large and had his initials C-E-H stitched inside the collar in thread the color of dried corn. She had a name. She had a deed to 160 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky, that the First Harlan Bank had already sent her 2 letters about. The first letter used the word concern. The second letter used the word foreclosure. The deadline printed on the second letter was January 15th, 2024. She had 104 days. The red Dodge Ram slowed on the shoulder half a mile north of the bus stop. A 2014 model, clean a man inside, who had not gotten clean for her sake, but had been clean already when he decided to stop. The window came down, and a man in his late 50s with a Pioneer seed cap and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone as the ridge, looked at her the way men at livestock auctions look at a heifer they have already priced in their head before the bidding opens. He did not introduce himself. He said, "You the Hollis girl?" She said she was. He made a sound through his nose, quite the kind of sound a man makes when he has laid a small bet and lost it. His name was Roy Decker. She would learn this in the truck. He owned the 240 acres east of the Hollis property, had farmed it for 36 years, and within 20 minutes of driving her up the long gravel lane to the farmhouse, he had used the phrase, "Do yourself a favor." 4 separate times, fair price, twice and once, quietly, almost gently as if he were doing her a kindness. He said, "This place took your grandfather, you know that." He offered her $58,000 cash for all 160 acres, the house, the barn, the 2 outbuildings, the equipment shed, and whatever was left of the small herd Cecil had kept in the north pasture. He said he could have the papers ready by Monday. He said a girl her age had better things ahead of her than frozen pipes and a tax bill she could not pay. She told him she would think on it. He laughed. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has already turned to the next page of a book, because he is certain how the chapter he is on will end, and he is simply being patient with the reading of it. He drove back down the lane, and the dust settled behind the Ram, and Wren stood in front of the farmhouse her grandfather had been born in 63 years before, and looked at it the way you look at something that is both smaller and larger than you remembered it being. The house was white clapboard, or had been white once, now the color of old cream where the paint had held, and bare gray wood where it had not. The porch ran the full width of the front Douglas fir boards, original to the 1938 build, and the third one from the door flexed a half-inch under her boot. The screen door had a spring that had been replaced at least twice. She could see the two older mounting holes above the current bracket. Inside the house smelled like cold wood stove and linseed oil, and underneath both of those, something faintly mineral, the smell of a building that had been lived in hard for a long time and was now holding its breath. The envelope from lawyer Preston Gall was on the kitchen table under a salt cellar shaped like a barn. She had expected to find it there. What she had not expected was the handwriting on the front. Her name, Wren, just that written in her grandfather's hand in pencil. She recognized it the way you recognize a voice in another room before you can make out the words. Cecil Hollis had written her name on that envelope, which meant he had put it there himself, which meant he had known. Inside the envelope were 3 keys on a loop of baling twine, a folded square of paper with a 6-digit combination written in the same pencil hand, and a single line at the bottom of the square that read, "The smokehouse first, the milkhouse south wall second. Don't let Decker tell you what belongs to who. He knows." She read the last line 4 times. The keys were ironed, 2 of them, and 1 small brass key, no bigger than her thumb, that caught the failing light through the kitchen window and held it longer than ironwood. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge and moved through the ironweed in the south pasture, and the sound it made was low and continuous, like something breathing slowly in the dark. She did not go to the smokehouse that night. The generator needed fuel. The water heater pilot had gone out sometime in September, and the north pasture gate was hanging open on one hinge, with 3 of Cecil's Herefords standing at the edge of the lane, looking at her with the patient blankness of animals that have been waiting longer than they expected. She spent the first 2 hours closing the gate with a piece of baling wire she found in the equipment shed, filling the generator tank from the red jerry can in the barn, and relighting the water heater pilot 3 times before the thermocouple caught. She ate a tin of soup cold because she could not find a pot that was not in the cabinet above the stove, which she could not reach without a step stool she had not yet located. She slept in her grandfather's barn coat on top of the quilt because she did not want to be under anything yet. The bedroom smelled like him. Bay rum and machine oil and something underneath that was just him, the particular smell of a person who has lived in one place long enough that the place begins to smell like them in return. At 4:47 in the morning, she woke to the sound of something on the porch. She lay still for 11 seconds. Then she heard it again, a soft, rhythmic creak, the 3rd board from the door. She got up, took the flashlight from the nightstand, a yellow Eveready that had been there since before she was born, and walked to the front room. Through the porch window, she could see the shape of a large dog, a blue-tick hound sitting on the top step, looking out at the lane as though it had been assigned to watch it. The dog turned and looked at her through the glass with yellow eyes and did not move. She opened the door. The dog came inside, walked to the braided rug in front of the cold stove, turned twice, and lay down. It wore a collar with a tag that said Pone on one side and had a Harlan County phone number on the other. She would call the number the next morning and learn that Pone had belonged to Cecil, that the neighbor who had been feeding him since March had been expecting someone to come for him, and that in 6 years the dog had never once gone home with anyone who came to collect him until now. She sat on the floor next to the dog until the windows began to gray. The January 15th deadline was a weight she could feel in the back of her throat. Not panic, not yet, but the pressure of a thing that is very large and very close. The next morning, Ida Pruitt came up the lane in a white Ford pickup with a covered dish on the passenger seat and the particular expression of a woman who has been deciding since yesterday whether to say something. She was 71 years old, with white hair and hands that had worked outside her whole life. She set the dish on the porch rail and said she had brought beef stew, her mother's recipe, and that she had known Cecil Hollis for 40 years, and that she was sorry. Wren thanked her, asked if she wanted coffee. Ida said she ought to get back, but sat down on the porch step anyway, the way women of a certain age sit when they have decided to say the thing they came to say. She said Decker was out here the day before you arrived. I saw his truck on the lane from my kitchen window. He's been out to every farm in this section since June. Then she said, "There's something else. My late husband Earl used to talk about your grandfather about something out here on this property that Cecil knew and nobody else did. Earl never said what it was exactly, only that it was the kind of thing that if Cecil ever decided to tell it, half the county would have to apologize for something. Earl's been gone 11 years, and I still think about that conversation. I'm telling you because I think you should know someone else remembered it." She pulled at a loose thread on her sleeve. Then she said there was a man from a company called Consolidated Ridge came around in April, about 3 weeks after your grandfather passed. Drove a black Tahoe, wore a suit that cost more than my truck. He asked me if I knew who was handling the Hollis estate and whether the family had received any offers on the mineral rights. I told him I didn't know anything about it. He left a card. I kept it. She took a business card from her coat pocket and set it on the porch rail next to the covered dish. The name on the card was Garrett Voss, Regional Director, Consolidated Ridge Mining Corporation, Nashville, Tennessee. Wren picked up the card and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Ida Pruitt watched her. Then she said, "Your grandfather was a careful man. In 40 years, I never once saw him throw away a piece of paper he had written on. Whatever Earl was talking about, if it exists, it's on this property somewhere." She left. Wren stood on the porch with the business card and the stew cooling in the dish and the tree line losing its shape against the late morning sky, and thought about the line her grandfather had written. The smokehouse first. The co-op in town was called Harlan Feed and Supply, and she needed antifreeze and a replacement thermocouple and a bolt for the gate hinge. She drove in on the Tuesday in Cecil's 1999 Ford F250, which ran rough below 2,000 RPM, but ran. The co-op parking lot held 6 trucks when she pulled in, all of them larger and newer than Cecil's. 3 men stood by the tailgate of a black Silverado near the door. One of them was Roy Decker. She took the list from her coat pocket and went inside. She was at the counter waiting for Dale Minter, the counterman, to locate a thermocouple for a 1990s-era Richmond water heater when she heard Decker come in behind her. She did not turn around. She heard him speak to Minter. Heard Minter say, "Morning." Roy heard the door open again and 2 more men come in. Then she heard Decker say to the room, and not particularly to her young girl driving Cecil's truck, that old man would have hated that. He said it the way a man says something he means to land, and then watch. One of the men by the door said, "She gonna try to run that place herself?" Decker said for about 6 weeks she is. Then First Harlan's going to do what First Harlan does, and I'm going to plant soybeans on that south field come spring. The room was quiet the way a room gets when everyone in it is waiting to see if the person being talked about will react. Another man near the seed display said it louder than the others, the way men say things when they want a crowd to hear and want to pretend they are only talking to one person. He said, "Cecil's gone, honey. You're a child. Best let the grown men sort this out before you get buried under what you don't understand." Wren put 2 bottles of antifreeze and a bolt on the counter. She looked at Dale Minter. He was 60 gray and had the look of a man watching a brush fire from a distance, hoping it would move the other way. She said, "Do you have the thermocouple or not?" Minter found it in 5 minutes. She paid cash and went back to the truck. Decker came out while she was loading the antifreeze into the bed. He stopped at the corner of the bumper and said that offer I made you is good through the end of the month. After that, I can't promise the number stays the same. She looked at him. He had pale blue eyes and a farmer's squint, permanent lines at the corners from 40 years of reading weather. He was the kind of man who had been large and strong at 30 and was still large but differently. Now the weight of him settled lower. She said, "I'll let you know." He nodded. Then he looked past her toward the south, toward the ridge, toward the far corner of the Hollis property, and something crossed his face that was not quite assessment and not quite memory. Something older than either of those things. He caught her watching him, and the expression closed like a cabinet door. He said Cecil kept some things out here that are better left alone, you know that? She waited. He said, "I'm not trying to threaten you. I'm trying to save you a winter of grief. That's all." He walked back to his truck. She stood by the F250 in the co-op lot with the antifreeze in the bed and the business card of Garrett Voss in her pocket and a line from a dead man in her memory. Don't let Decker tell you what belongs to who. He knows. She drove home on Route 421 with the heater fan rattling at medium and Pony sitting straight on the passenger seat, looking out the window with the alert dignity of a dog who has decided you are trustworthy enough to be navigated by. She found the smokehouse that afternoon. It stood about 90 feet behind the main barn, set into the low rise of the hill, so its back wall pressed against the slope. It was original chestnut board construction, dark with age, with a flat tar roof and one small window on the north side. The padlock on the door was a master number 3, brass-bodied, the kind they had sold at the hardware in Cumberland since before she was born. The second key on the baling twine ring turned it on the first try. The shackle opened with a dry click that was very loud in the stillness. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment and did not open it. Pone sat behind her on the dead grass and watched the ridge with his ears forward. She was afraid not of the building. She was afraid of what it meant that her grandfather had hidden something here. She was afraid of what it meant that he had died in March, and that by April, a man from a Nashville mining company was asking about mineral rights. She was afraid of the gap between those two facts and what might live in it. She pulled the door open. The hinges did not scream. They sighed. The smell that came out was dry paper and cold iron, and underneath those, the faint sweetness of linseed oil, the smell of something preserved with care. Not a building left to die. A building maintained for a purpose. The floor was poured concrete, which was wrong for a building this age. Whoever had put it in had gone to the expense of a proper slab when dirt would have been cheaper. The walls were the original chestnut boards and tools hung on iron pegs at regular intervals. Long-handled things, a draw knife, 2 adzes, a set of tongs whose jaws she could not name yet. A leather apron on a separate peg, oiled recently, enough that the leather still moved when she touched it. Recently meaning within the last year. Cecil had been in here, maintaining things, not leaving them to go to rust. Against the far wall, under an oilcloth tarp, was a shape about the size and height of a small chest. She did not go to it first. She walked the walls the way her grandfather had taught her, to walk a fence line before running cattle on new pasture, slow looking for what did not belong. On the workbench along the east wall, she found the tin box. It was about the length of her forearm, unpainted steel with a hinged lid and a small hasp and no lock. The kind of box hardware stores sold for keeping nails dry. On the lid, her grandfather had written in permanent marker, in the careful block letters he used when he wanted something to last Wren first. Her name. Not granddaughter, not to whom it may concern. Her name. Her hands were not steady when she opened it. Inside were 4 things. A folded piece of lined paper in her grandfather's handwriting. A photograph, black and white, of a man she did not recognize standing in front of a building that was not a barn, holding a piece of furniture. A brass plate, about the size of a playing card, with lettering she had to bring close to the window light to read. And a key, small flat, different from the ones on the baling twine ring, with a paper tag tied through the head that said South Wall, Milkhouse Low. She read the letter first. It was 2 pages the same forward-leaning script from the kitchen envelope. He had written it on February 11th, 2023, 1 month before he died. He wrote that he had not told her these things while he was alive, because he had not wanted to put the weight of them on her before she was ready, and that he was not certain she was ready now, but that January 15th was January 15th, and ready or not was no longer a question she had the luxury of taking slowly. He wrote that the property she had inherited was not what the county records said it was. He wrote that in November of 1941, his father, Willis Hollis, had purchased a separate parcel of 38 acres from a man named Lester Boone for $310 cash. He wrote that this parcel ran along the southern boundary of the main property below the cedar windbreak, and that it had never been merged into the main deed, because Willis had kept it under Boone's name on the tax rolls and had paid Lester Boone's widow $2 a year until 1958 to keep her name on the paperwork. He wrote that this was not honest and that his father had done it because the banks in 1941 could not touch what they could not find, and that the arrangement had simply continued because the people who knew about it had not died at convenient times. He wrote that an engineer named Harold Finch had walked the South Field with him in the spring of 1969 and told him the 38 acres had something underneath the south third of it that was worth more than the rest of the farm put together. He wrote that Harold Finch had been a careful man who understood what happened to careful men who produced careful reports about things larger companies wanted. He wrote that the original copy of Finch's report was in the hidden room behind the south wall of the milk house, on the top shelf first jar on the left, and that if anyone ever told her that report did not exist, she would be holding the proof that it did. He wrote that he had never done anything with the information because his father had made him promise not to, on the grounds that the land had given the Hollis family enough and would give more if they let it rest, and that he had honored that promise for 54 years. The last paragraph was short. He wrote, "If you are reading this, the farm is in trouble, and you are alone with it. I am sorry for both of those things, but I want you to understand something clearly. You are not as alone as it feels right now. What is under that south field has been there since before any of us were born. It will still be there after Decker's lawyers have gone home and First Harlan's loan officer has found something else to foreclose on. Go to the milk house. Go before the snow. Do not go to Decker first. Do not go to the bank first. Go to the milk house, and then you will know what you are actually working with." She folded the letter along its creases and put it back in the tin box. She looked at the brass plate. The lettering read, Hollis & Sons, Cumberland, Kentucky, 1941. There were no sons. Cecil had been an only child. His father, Willis, had been an only child. She had known this the way you know the floor plan of a house you grew up visiting, without ever having been told it explicitly. She put the plate back in the box. She put the tin box inside her coat against her ribs. She stood in the middle of the smokehouse floor with the oilcloth tarp in front of her and the linseed oil smell around her and the January 15th deadline, counting itself down somewhere in the back of her chest, like a second heartbeat she had not asked for. Then she crossed the floor and lifted the corner of the tarp. The cabinet underneath was quarter-sawn oak, 4 drawers low enough to be a blanket chest except for the brass plate on the top. She read it twice with her face close to the metal. The lettering was engraved, not stamped, cut by hand. Hollis and Sons, Cumberland, Kentucky, 1941. Below the name, a second line, established in service. She pulled the top drawer open. It slid on hand-cut dovetail runners smooth enough that she felt the breath of air it pushed. Inside were ledgers, 4 of them, bound in black oilcloth, stacked flat. The dates were written on the spines in white paint. 1935 to 1941, 1941 to 1949, 1949 to 1958, 1958 to 1966. She lifted the first ledger out. The oilcloth was cold against her palms. She opened it on the workbench, and the pages were heavy rag paper, the kind that deepens instead of yellowing, and the handwriting on the first page was small and patient and slanted right. She had seen it before on the back of a photograph in a hat box in the upstairs bedroom. Her great-grandfather, Willis Hollis. The first entry read, October 14th, 1935. 1 gate latch, Earl Combs, $2 paid. 1 fence brace, $3 paid in eggs value, assessed at $3 fair. She turned the page. The work was real work, not hobby work. Fences, gates, hinges, braces, plowshares, resharpened wagon axles, reset. The kind of work that kept farms running. The kind of work that did not stop because it could not stop. She turned pages until the light through the smokehouse window went flat and gray, and she realized the afternoon was gone. She was almost at the end of the first ledger when she found the entry. October 3rd, 1936. Gate latch repair. Roy Decker Sr., $4. Note outstanding from 1934. $120 fence line survey witness fee. Refused to sign. He knows where the east line runs. She read it twice. Then a third time with her finger under each word. Roy Decker Sr., the father of the man who had driven her up this lane and told her, "This place took your grandfather." The man who had been farming 11 feet of Hollis land along the east boundary for 36 years. The son of a man who had refused to sign a survey witness sheet in 1934 because he knew where the east line ran and had reasons for preferring that no one put that knowledge on paper. She closed the ledger. She put it back in the drawer. She put the tin box against her ribs under the coat and walked back across the dead grass to the house with Pone at her heel and the county road empty in the falling dark and the ironweed moving slow in the south pasture and the January 15th deadline, pressing against the inside of her sternum like a palm laid flat against a door. She had 103 days. She had a name, a deed, a letter from a dead man, a brass plate that proved a business that should not have existed, ledgers that went back to the worst years, and a key on a paper tag that said, South Wall Milk House Low. She had not yet been to the milk house. She sat at the kitchen table with the tin box open in front of her, and the Garrett Voss business card next to it, and the first ledger open to the October 3rd, 1936 entry. She looked at all 3 things together. A mining company director who had come around 3 weeks after Cecil died, asking about mineral rights. A neighbor whose father had refused to witness a survey because he knew where the true boundary was and had reasons to prefer no one else did. a report from 1969 that said the south field was worth more than the rest of the farm put together. She picked up the business card. She set it back down. She went to bed with the tin box on the nightstand and the brass key on the paper tag in her closed hand, and the sound of Pone breathing on the rug by the cold stove, and outside the wind off the ridge low and steady, and the ironweed moving in the dark field, and the whole south boundary of the property, lying out there in the dark, holding what it had been holding for 82 years, patient as stone, waiting for someone who would finally know what to do with it. She did not sleep past 4. The brass key was still in her hand when she woke, the paper tag, damp from her palm, the ink on it slightly blurred. She had held it through the night the way a child holds something small and certain when the dark is large and uncertain. She set it on the nightstand next to the tin box and lay still for a moment, listening to the county. Wind off the ridge. A calf somewhere in the north pasture calling for something it was not going to get. Pone shifting on the rug by the stove, his tags clicking once, then silence. She got up and put on her grandfather's coat and went to the milk house before the sun came over the ridge. The milk house was a concrete block building about 30 feet off the east side of the barn, low-roofed with a north door wide enough for milk cans and a south wall that from outside looked like solid block. She had noticed the south wall the first day without registering what she was noticing. The building from outside was longer than the washroom inside, about 7 feet longer, the length of a tall man lying flat. The kind of discrepancy a child does not measure and an adult does not question, because the wall has always been that length and there has never been a reason to ask why. The key on the paper tag fit a keyhole set low on the interior south wall, about waist height behind a small iron plate, gone dark with age. She had to set her shoulder against the door and push. The hinges gave a sound like something exhaling after a very long time of holding its breath. Inside was a room 6 feet deep and 8 feet across. Narrow pine board walls painted cream once, and now the color of old paper. A bare bulb on a cloth-wrapped cord. 3 shelves floor to ceiling on the left wall, built rough, the lumber cut by hand. On the shelves stood mason jars, 40 of them, sealed under zinc rings, nothing preserved inside, only paper. Rolled documents, folded letters, a small notebook with a water-stained cover, all sealed dry in glass that had been keeping out the damp for longer than she had been alive. She took the notebook first. The cover said, Harold Finch Field Notes, Spring 1969, Harlan County Survey, Hollis South Parcel. She opened it on the washroom floor, with the door propped behind her, and read it in the gray, early light. Finch had been thorough. He had walked the 38 acres twice, taken cores at 9 points along the southern third, and written his conclusions in the careful shorthand of a man who knew his findings would matter to someone eventually. The anthracite seam ran northeast to southwest across the lower 20 acres. He estimated the accessible deposit at between 40 and 50,000 tons. He had written at current market rates, this deposit represents a minimum value of $1.8 million likely to appreciate significantly, with projected industrial demand through the 1980s. Below that, in different ink, written later, he had added a single line. C. Hollis received original copy, October 14th, 1969. Duplicate filed with State Geological Office under General Survey Index, not under parcel name. H.F. Finch had protected it. He had filed the duplicate under a general index, where it would not be found by anyone searching the Hollis name, but would still exist if someone with the survey number went looking. He had understood exactly what he was dealing with, and had done the careful thing. She put the notebook inside her coat. She took 3 of the mason jars and carried them to the kitchen table, Then she went back for 3 more. She spent the morning reading. The jars held 41 years of paper. Receipts, survey fragments, a water rights document from 1918 that predated anything the county had on record, two letters from Willis Hollis to a lawyer in Lexington, dated 1943, asking about the legal process for establishing adverse possession, and 6 pages torn loose from the back of the 1941 ledger, separated deliberately documenting the Boone parcel tax payments from 1942 through 1958 in Willis Hollis's own hand. In the 4th jar she opened, she found a folded survey map, hand-drawn in careful lines by a surveyor named Thomas Alcott, dated 1934, showing the eastern boundary of the Hollis property, running exactly where she already suspected it ran. 11 feet east of where the fence currently stood. She set the 1934 map next to a second map she found 3 jars later. This one dated 1961, drawn in different hands but showing the identical line. 2 surveys, 27 years apart, both showing the same boundary. She set the Harold Finch notebook next to both of them. She set the entry from the 1936 ledger, which she had photographed on her phone the night before, next to that. Roy Decker Sr. had refused to sign as survey witness in 1934 because he knew where the east line ran. His son Roy had been farming 11 feet of Hollis ground for 36 years. And Garrett Voss of Consolidated Ridge Mining Corp. had been asking about mineral rights 3 weeks after Cecil died. She looked at the Voss business card for a long time. Then she put it face down on the table. She needed to understand the full geometry of what she was holding before she spoke to anyone. The first Harlan Bank letter was under the salt cellar where she had left it. She read it again with the Finch notebook open beside it. Marcus Webb. Loan officer, First Harlan Bank, had sent the foreclosure notice dated September 28, 2023. The outstanding balance on the operating note was $41,000. Cecil had borrowed against the operating line in January and February of 2023, amounts he had not borrowed in the 17 previous years of the note's history. She had not understood that pattern before. She understood it now. Cecil had been sick, and he had known it, and he had used the operating line not for equipment or seed, but for something else. The expenditures were listed only as operational. She would need the bank statements to know more. She drove to First Harlan Bank on Thursday morning. Marcus Webb was behind the glass partition in the second office from the left. He was 43, she would later learn, with the particular smoothness of a man who had spent 2 decades making difficult conversations feel administrative. He shook her hand without standing up and gestured at the chair across from him with the pen he was holding, the way a man gestures at a chair when he wants you to feel like a number that has been assigned a seat. She told him she wanted the full statement history on the Hollis operating note. He said he would need to verify her standing as a state beneficiary, a process that typically took 7 to 10 business days. She put the letter from Preston Gall on his desk. The letter that named her as sole heir and legal representative of the Cecil Hollis estate. Gall had had it notarized on September 15th. Webb picked it up with 2 fingers, the way a man picks up a document he has already decided is insufficient, and read it with the practiced unhurry of someone who is paid by the hour. He said the note had a balance of $41,000 and the estate had 30 days from the date of the notice to bring the account current before formal foreclosure proceedings began. She asked again for the statement history. He said the request would need to go through the estate verification process. She said you sent a foreclosure notice to a 17-year-old girl at a property address in care of an estate that hadn't cleared probate yet, which means you already determined her standing was sufficient to receive legal notice. So either she has standing or she doesn't. Webb looked at her over the top of the Gall letter with the expression of a man who has been handed a problem he did not schedule for today. He set the letter down. He said he would have someone pull the statement history and mail it to the property address within 5 business days. She said she would wait. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. 14 minutes later, a woman came from the back with a printed statement history covering the last 3 years of the operating note. Webb slid it across the desk without comment. She folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and left. In the truck, she read it in the parking lot with the engine running for heat. Cecil had borrowed $11,000 in January and $8,000 in February, neither amount against equipment. The memo lines read operational expenses, both of them in the same typed format as every other entry, but the withdrawal method was cash both times. Cecil Hollis had withdrawn $19,000 in cash in the last 2 months of his life, and she did not know why, and the answer was somewhere on this property in a jar or a drawer, or under a floor she had not yet opened. She sat in the parking lot for a while. Then she put the truck in gear and drove back to Route 421. That night, she found the second notebook. It was in the bottom drawer of the oak cabinet in the smokehouse, under the last ledger in the stack wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a strip of electrical tape. The cover said, Cecil E. Hollis, Private Record, 2020 to 2023. She sat on the smokehouse floor with the lantern close and read it from the first entry. Cecil had known about Consolidated Ridge since 2020. They had first approached him in August of that year through a land agent named Pruitt, who had come to the door offering to discuss mineral leasing options on the South Field. Cecil had said he was not interested, and Pruitt had left. In October 2020, Pruitt had come back with a number. Cecil had written it in the notebook. $420,000 for a 60-year mineral lease on the 38-acre parcel. Cecil had said no. In 2021, Pruitt had stopped coming, and a lawyer's letter had arrived instead from a firm in Nashville, informing Cecil that Consolidated Ridge had conducted a title search and had questions about the legal standing of the South Parcel deed, which appeared to be recorded under a different name than the current claimant. Cecil had written they found the Boone deed. They are trying to cloud the title. He had contacted a lawyer in Lexington. He had spent $4,000 he could not afford on a title opinion that confirmed his position but cost him the month of December. In 2022, the Nashville law firm had sent 2 more letters. Cecil had responded through the Lexington lawyer each time. The letters had stopped in November 2022. In January 2023, the First Harlan Bank had called Cecil about his operating line. Cecil had written, Webb called, said the note is under review due to property valuation concerns. Said a recent appraisal suggested the collateral value of the main parcel had declined. Asked if I wanted to discuss restructuring. Cecil had written, I've had this note for 17 years without a late payment. They never called about collateral before. He had written, I asked who ordered the appraisal. Webb said it was standard procedure. It is not standard procedure. I've had this note for 17 years. She sat with the notebook in her lap and the lantern hissing softly at her knee, and outside the wind off the ridge, moving through the cedar windbreak at the south boundary of the property. The same windbreak that ran along the top edge of the 38 acres where the anthracite seam ran northeast to southwest below the frost line. Consolidated Ridge had not stopped. They had changed methods. They had found a loan officer who was willing to manufacture a valuation concern, and they had used the operating note as a lever to put pressure on a 63-year-old man with a sick heart, who had no family nearby, and $41,000 standing between him and the loss of everything Willis Hollis had paid $310 for in 1941. Cecil had borrowed the $19,000 in cash to pay the Lexington lawyer. He had not told the lawyer where the money came from. He had written, "If I tell him about the Finch report, he will want to go on a fence, and I'm not ready to go on a fence. I need to make sure Wren has everything she needs first. I need her to be the one who goes on a fence. She will know when." She read that line 3 times. He had known he was dying. He had spent the last winter of his life not fighting, but preparing. Buying her time by paying lawyers to slow letters down, sealing documents in jars, writing a notebook she would find in March, and a letter she would find in October. He had not fought because he had known that the fight was not his to win. He had understood that a sick old man with a Lexington lawyer was not the right weapon for what Consolidated Ridge had built. But a 17-year-old girl with a deed, a geological survey, 2 boundary maps, and a ledger entry from 1936 was something different entirely. She put the notebook in the tin box with the Finch notes and the brass key. She did not sleep that night. Garrett Voss arrived on a Wednesday. She heard the Tahoe on the gravel before she saw it. The particular sound of a heavy vehicle moving slowly, the way men move when they want to seem unhurried. She was in the equipment shed adjusting the tension on the north pasture gate when he came around the corner of the barn. He was taller than she had imagined from the business card, 6'2", with the posture of a man who had been told he looked authoritative and had decided to believe it. The suit was charcoal, not navy, but close. The shoes were dark leather with a shine that had already been compromised by the mud between the barn and the equipment shed. He had a young man with him who carried a leather folder and said nothing. Voss stopped about 8 feet from her and smiled the way men smile when they are about to offer you something they consider generous. He said his name and his company name as though she might not remember, and said he was sorry for her loss, and said he had been trying to reach the estate for some weeks and was glad to finally have the opportunity to speak with her directly. She kept her hands on the gate tension rod. He said Consolidated Ridge had a long-standing interest in the mineral potential of the south portion of the Hollis property, and that given the current financial situation of the estate, they wanted to make sure she was aware of all her options before January. He said the company was prepared to offer $340,000 for the full 160 acres, which would retire the bank note, cover the estate legal costs, and leave her with a substantial remainder. She looked at him. He said, "You're 17 years old. You're managing a property with deferred maintenance, aging equipment, an operating deficit, and a bank that is already in motion. We want to make this easy for you. 340 is a fair number for what you're working with here." She said, "What am I working with here?" He looked at her with the careful patience of a man who is deciding how much to say. He said, "A farm that's been running at a loss for 3 years. A note that's 90 days from default, and a title situation on the south parcel that is going to complicate any other sale you might try to arrange." She said, "What title situation?" He said there are questions about the provenance of the deed on the lower 38 acres that a title company is going to flag before any bank will lend against it. He said Consolidated Ridge had done its due diligence and was prepared to take on that complexity, which was reflected in the offer. He said most buyers would not be willing to do that. She looked at the mud on his shoes. She looked at the young man with the leather folder who was watching the ridge with the expression of a man trying not to be in the room he was in. She said she would need some time to think about it. Voss said he understood, and that the offer was good through the end of October. He handed her a document from the leather folder and said it was a letter of intent, non-binding, just to indicate the parties were in conversation. Nothing she needed to sign today. She took it. She did not look at it. He said, "I want to be straight with you. The bank is going to move on this in January. That is not a threat, that is a calendar. If you get to January without a plan, the outcome will not be in your control. This offer puts it back in your control." He smiled again. Then he and the young man walked back around the barn, and the Tahoe moved back down the gravel lane, and she stood in the equipment shed doorway with the letter of intent in her hand and the gate tension rod in the other, and listened to the sound of the tires on Route 421 until they were gone. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She put the letter of intent on the table. She put the Cecil notebook next to it. She put the Finch report next to that. The letter of intent was 4 pages. On the 3rd page under property description, the south parcel was described as approximately 38 acres, more or less subject to title verification. On the 4th page under mineral rights, there was a paragraph that said the purchaser would acquire all surface and subsurface rights to the described property in perpetuity. In perpetuity? She picked up a pen. She held it over the signature line on page 4. $340,000 would retire the banknote. It would cover the Lexington lawyer. It would leave her with enough to go somewhere else and start something else. She was 17 years old, and she had been awake for 36 hours. And the gate in the north pasture still needed fixing, and the thermocouple was running warm, and the south field was sitting under 6 inches of early frost. And she had $380 and 101 days. She held the pen over the line for a long time. Then she put the pen down. She put it down because she had just read the 4th page again, and the word perpetuity was not the word a man uses when he is buying a farm. Perpetuity was the word a man uses when he is buying something he intends to dig out of the ground for the next 60 years. And a man who wanted to buy something he intended to dig out of the ground for 60 years was not offering her a fair price. He was offering her the minimum number that he calculated would make her sign before she understood what she was signing. She put the letter of intent face down on the table. She opened the Finch notebook to the page where Harold Finch had written his estimate. 40 to 50,000 tons of high-grade anthracite at 1969 prices had been worth $1.8 million. She did not know what 45,000 tons of anthracite was worth in 2023, but she knew how to find out. She had a phone with an internet connection, and she had a night with nowhere to be. She spent the next 4 hours reading. At 2 a.m, she closed the phone and sat in the dark kitchen with the stove ticking as the fire in it settled and Pone breathing on the rug and the numbers she had found sitting in her head like something that had been placed there very carefully by someone who knew exactly where it needed to go. The current market rate for high-grade anthracite was between $240 and $280 per ton, depending on grade and access. 45,000 tons at the midpoint rate was $11.7 million in gross mineral value. She had no idea what extraction costs were. She had no idea what the actual accessible tonnage was beyond Finch's 1969 estimate. But she knew that a man who came to a farm in a charcoal suit with a leather folder and offered $340,000 for a property sitting on $11 million in mineral value was not making her an offer. He was stealing from her slowly enough that she was supposed to feel grateful for the pace. She went to the county assessor's office the next morning. She had 2 reasons. She needed to file a formal request for a boundary survey review based on the 1934 and 1961 maps, which she had photographed and printed at the library in Cumberland the afternoon before. And she needed the public record of the Boone parcel deed, which should have shown the tax payment history that Cecil's notebook described. The assessor's office was in the county courthouse on Central Street, a room with fluorescent lights and filing cabinets and a counter, with a laminate top worn white at the edges. The woman at the counter was 60 or so, and had the expression of a person who has answered the same questions for 20 years, and finds the questions neither interesting nor offensive, just weather. Wren asked for the deed history on the Boone parcel by the legal description from the Finch survey. The woman typed. She looked at the screen. She typed again. Then she looked up and said, "That parcel is currently under a pending title review filed by Consolidated Ridge Mining Corp. in August of this year." Wren said, "What does that mean?" The woman said it meant Consolidated Ridge had filed a claim that the deed provenance on the parcel was irregular and had requested the county hold the record pending resolution. Wren said, "Can they do that?" The woman said with a lawyer, "Yes." Wren said, "Can I see the filing?" The woman printed it. Wren read it at the counter. It was 4 pages of dense legal language, but the core of it was simple. Consolidated Ridge was claiming that because the parcel had been carried under the Boone name on tax records for 17 years after the alleged 1941 sale, and because there was no recorded deed transfer in the county register, the title was ambiguous and the current claimed ownership by the Hollis estate was unverified, which was exactly what Voss had called a title situation, which was a problem he had helped create by filing this document in August, 2 months before he came to her door with a letter of intent. She was still reading the filing when the door behind the counter opened, and a young man in county employee khakis came out carrying a stack of folders. He stopped when he saw her. He was about 25, with Ida Pruitt's cheekbones and her way of going still before speaking. He said, "You're the Hollis girl." She said she was. He looked at the filing in her hands. Something moved across his face that was not quite guilt and not quite relief. He said, "My mother told me you'd come in here eventually." He said, "I think there's something you should see." He looked at the woman behind the counter. He said, "I'm going to take my lunch break, Donna." His name was Cal Pruitt. He was Ida's youngest. He worked in the Records and Assessments Division and had worked there for 3 years. He walked her to his truck in the parking lot and sat in the driver's seat and did not start the engine. He looked straight ahead through the windshield at the courthouse wall for a moment. Then he said, "In March of this year, about 2 weeks after your grandfather passed, Marcus Webb from First Harlan Bank came in here and requested a property valuation update on the Hollis Main parcel. That's not unusual. Banks do it. What was unusual was that Webb came in person, which loan officers don't do, and that he specifically requested that the valuation be conducted by a contracted appraiser rather than the county assessor's staff. He asked for a man named Putnam from Corbin. He said the bank had used Putnam before and trusted his methodology." Cal Pruitt reached into the folder on the seat between them and took out a printed email chain. He set it on the dashboard. He said, "I handle the contractor coordination. Putnam billed the county for his appraisal work. The county paid Putnam. But 3 weeks after Putnam filed his report showing the Hollis valuation had declined by 30%, I was reconciling contractor files and I found that Putnam had received a second payment. Not from the county. From a consulting firm in Nashville called Ridgeland Advisory, LLC. I looked up Ridgeland Advisory. It is a registered subsidiary of Consolidated Ridge Mining Corporation." Wren picked up the email chain. The emails were between Putnam and an address at Ridgeland Advisory. The first email said as discussed, the revised valuation should reflect deferred maintenance concerns and market softness in the Harlan County agricultural sector. The second email from Putnam said, understood the report will show a decline of at least 25% from the prior assessment, which should support the bank's collateral concern position. The third email from Ridgeland Advisory said payment has been processed. Thank you for your professionalism. She read it twice. Cal Pruitt said, "I don't know what to do with this. I've been sitting on it since April. I don't know who to take it to." Webb is connected to 3 people on the county board, and Consolidated Ridge has a lawyer in Nashville who makes people's problems go away. I'm a 25-year-old records clerk. She looked at the emails on the dashboard. The manufactured collateral concerned the operating note under review, the title cloud filed in August. It was not a coincidence, and it was not incompetence. It was a sequence. Someone had planned it step by step, beginning 2 months after Cecil turned down the first offer in 2020, and ending with a foreclosure notice to a 17-year-old girl with $380 and a deadline of January 15th. She said, "Can I have a copy of this?" Cal Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I already made one." He took a second set of pages from the folder. He said, "My mother trusts you. That's enough for me." She drove back to the farm on Route 421, with the copied emails on the passenger seat, and Pone watching the road with his ears forward and Black Mountain going gray in the north, and the ironweed moving in the south pasture. And for the first time since she had stepped off the Greyhound bus at the corner of Route 421 and Cutter's Mill Road, she felt something that was not weight. It was not relief either. It was something smaller and colder and more useful than either of those things. She knew what she was working with now. She pulled into the lane and stopped the truck and sat for a moment, looking at the farmhouse. The porch light was on, which she had not left on. She looked at the porch. Roy Decker was sitting on the top step in the dark. He stood when the headlights found him. He walked to the edge of the porch and waited while she got out of the truck. Pone moved to her heel without being told and stayed there. Decker had not dressed up. Work coat, work boots, the pioneer cap. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set in the way of a man who has rehearsed what he wants to say and is now finding the rehearsal insufficient. He said, "I want to talk to you about the East Line." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went inside. She came back out with the 2 survey maps and the 1936 ledger photograph and the Hollis tin box, and she set all of it on the porch rail next to the porch light where he could see it clearly. She did not say anything. He looked at the 1934 survey map. He looked at the 1961 survey map. He looked at the ledger entry photograph, his father's name, and the words refused to sign. He knows where the East Line runs in Willis Hollis's careful hand from October of 1936. He stood there for a long time. The wind off the ridge moved through the ironweed in the south pasture. The porch light threw a yellow circle that reached just to the edge of the steps. Beyond it, the lane was dark, and the property ran south and east in the dark, all 160 acres of it, plus the 38 that Lester Boone had sold to Willis Hollis for $310 in November of 1941, carrying more underneath it than 3 generations of the Hollis family had ever taken out of it. Decker picked up the 1934 map. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set it back on the rail. He said, "My father made a mistake a long time ago." She waited. He said, "I've been farming that east strip for 36 years, and I told myself it was close enough that it didn't matter." She waited. He said, "What do you want?" She said, "I want a signed affidavit from you, confirming the true east boundary, as shown in the 1934 survey. I want it notarized. I want it filed with the county recorder's office." He looked at her. She was 17 years old and 108 pounds in her grandfather's barn coat, standing on a porch in the dark in Harlan County, Kentucky, with a blue tick hound at her heel and a box of papers that reached back to 1934. He said, "And if I do that?" She said, "Then I know exactly where my land ends, and someone else can figure out where theirs begins." He was quiet for a long time. The calf in the north pasture called once and went silent. Decker said, "There's people in Nashville who are not going to be happy about this." She said, "I know." He put on his cap and walked down the porch steps and got in the Dodge Ram and backed down the lane and turned south on Route 421 and his taillights went red in the dark, and then the dark took them. She picked up the maps and the ledger photograph and the tin box and went inside and set them on the kitchen table next to the Cecil notebook and the Finch report and the email chain from Cal Pruitt. She put the Garrett Voss letter of intent on top of the stack, face down, the signature line pressed flat against the table. She had 98 days, and somewhere in Nashville, in an office with a view, a man named Garrett Voss did not yet know that the 17-year-old girl he had offered $340,000 had spent the last 6 days building the exact case that would make that offer the most expensive thing he had ever put his name on. She did not hear from Decker for 4 days. She did not hear from Voss either. The silence from both directions had a different quality. Decker's silence felt like a man sitting with something heavy, turning it over, measuring its weight against his own. Voss's silence felt like the silence before weather, the kind that comes when a system is still organizing itself over the ridge and has not yet decided how hard to arrive. She used the 4 days. She called Carol Finch on a Thursday morning, found the number through the Kentucky Bar Association directory. Carol Finch, attorney at law, Lexington, estate and property litigation. The call rang 4 times, and then a woman's voice came on unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that urgency was a tool other people used to make you move before you were ready. Wren told her who she was, told her she had Harold Finch's original field notebook from 1969. There was a silence on the line that was different from the silences she had been living with. This one had texture to it, the texture of 30 years of waiting for a specific phone call. Carol Finch said, "Where are you?" She drove to Lexington the next morning in Cecil's F250 with the Finch notebook and the Cecil notebook and the email chain from Cal Pruitt in the tin box on the passenger seat, and Pone in the back watching the highway unroll behind them, with the patience of a dog who has decided that wherever you are going is probably fine. Carol Finch's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Limestone Street, with a view of the street below, and bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls. She was 61 years old, slight with gray hair cut short, and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from having been very angry for a very long time, and having learned to keep it precisely organized. She shook Wren's hand once and sat down and put on reading glasses and held out her hand for the notebook. She read it without speaking. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and looked at Wren over the glasses. She said my father gave Cecil Hollis that notebook in October of 1969. 6 weeks later, 2 men from a company called Ridge Extraction, which was the predecessor company to what is now Consolidated Ridge, came to my father's office in Hazard and told him his survey license would be reviewed by the state board if he continued to conduct independent mineral assessments in Harlan County without going through their contracted survey firm. My father was 42 years old. He had a wife and 3 children and a license he had spent 8 years earning. He stopped doing independent work. She took off the glasses. She said he told me about the Hollis survey 2 years before he died. He said it was the thing he was most ashamed of. Not that he had stopped, but that he had not found a way to make sure the information got to someone who could use it. He thought Cecil would find a way. And then Cecil was gone, and I did not know if the notebook still existed. Wren put the email chain on the desk next to the notebook. Carol Finch read it. Her expression did not change, but something behind it did a very small adjustment, the way a door that has been sealed for a long time shifts in its frame when the pressure outside finally equalizes. She said, "This is Marcus Webb." Wren said it was. Carol Finch said, "And this is Ridgeland Advisory." Wren said it was. Carol Finch looked at the emails for a moment longer. Then she said, "I need you to understand what you have. You have the original geological survey showing the mineral value. You have the Cecil Hollis private record documenting the pattern of harassment and the manufactured title dispute. You have documentary evidence of a bank officer receiving payment from a subsidiary of the company attempting to acquire the property. You have 2 boundary surveys showing the Decker encroachment. And you have a deed history showing continuous Hollis use and tax payment on the Boone parcel since 1941. Wren said, and I have 94 days. Carol Finch said I've been waiting 30 years to file something against Consolidated Ridge. 94 days is plenty of time. She took the case that morning for a deferred fee arrangement, her full payment contingent on resolution. She said she had 3 colleagues she wanted to bring in, 1 in property law, 1 in banking regulation, and 1 who had been a federal prosecutor for 12 years and now did private practice, and had been looking for a RICO predicate in the eastern Kentucky mineral sector for the better part of a decade. She said she would need the originals of everything for filing purposes and that Wren should go home and not speak to Voss Webb or Decker until she called. Wren drove back to Harlan County on Route 421 with the tin box lighter in the passenger seat and Pone asleep in the back for the first time since Lexington. She stopped at the co-op in town for antifreeze and a new pair of work gloves. Dale Minter was behind the counter. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the first time, the careful look of a man trying to assess which direction a situation was moving. She put the antifreeze and the gloves on the counter. He said, "Heard you've been to the courthouse?" She said she had. He said, "People are talking." She said, "People can talk." He rang up the antifreeze and the gloves. She paid cash. He slid the change across the counter, and then very quietly, as if the sentence had been sitting in him for a while and had finally found its way out, he said, "Cecil Hollis fixed my father's cultivator in 1987 and would not take a single dollar for it. I'm telling you that because I think you should know the kind of man your grandfather was." She picked up the bag. She said, "I know what kind of man he was." She drove home. The court notice arrived on a Tuesday nailed to the front door. She found it at 6:14 in the morning when she went out to start the generator. It was stapled inside a manila envelope with the Consolidated Ridge Mining Corp logo in the upper left corner, and the words "Emergency Injunction to Freeze. Property Activity. Case number 2, 3-CV-1-847, Eastern District of Kentucky," printed in the header. She read it standing on the porch in the cold, with her breath making small clouds in the still air. Consolidated Ridge had filed an emergency injunction in federal court, seeking to freeze all activity on the Hollis property, pending resolution of the title dispute on the south parcel. The filing claimed that recent activity on the property, specifically the filing of a boundary survey review at the county recorder's office, constituted an attempt to alter the status of disputed assets in anticipation of litigation. They were asking the court to prevent her from filing any further documents, selling any portion of the property, or making any material changes to the land until the title question was resolved. She read it once. Then she went inside. She called Carol Finch. Carol said, "I was expecting this. Give me the case number." Wren read it. Carol said they filed in federal court because they think it will take longer for you to respond in federal court. They're wrong. I'm going to file our response by end of day, and I'm going to file it with everything attached. She paused. She said, "I want you to understand something. They filed this injunction because they are afraid of you. A company that is confident in its position does not file emergency motions to freeze the activity of a 17-year-old girl in Harlan County, Kentucky. They are trying to stop you from moving, which means they know that if you keep moving, they lose." She hung up. Wren put the court notice on the kitchen table next to everything else. She put on her grandfather's coat and went out to fix the north pasture gate, because the gate still needed fixing, and nothing about a court filing changed the fact that the hinge bolt was stripped, and the Herefords needed a working gate before the next freeze. She spent the morning on the gate. Pone sat on the fence rail and watched her work, with the solemn attention of an inspector who has no opinion but intends to observe every detail. By noon, she had the hinge reset with a new bolt and a section of angle iron she had found in the equipment shed welded to the post to reinforce it. She had learned to run a bead on the stick welder by watching a video twice and then trying it 4 times on scrap iron before she trusted it on the post. Cecil had left the welder. He had left the stick rods. He had left a pair of leather welding gloves hanging on the second peg from the left in the equipment shed that fit her hands when she wore 2 pairs of work socks underneath them. He had left everything she needed, and it had occurred to her sometime around the 3rd week of October that this was not accident. He had maintained the equipment. He had kept the tools oiled and the consumables stocked. He had been preparing the property to be workable by someone who did not yet know how to work it, which meant he had been preparing it for her. Carol called on a Friday. She said the federal court had denied the emergency injunction. She said the judge had reviewed the motion and found that the activities, Consolidated Ridge, sought to enjoin specifically the filing of a boundary survey review with the county recorder, were constitutionally protected property rights activities that could not be frozen pending a title dispute without a showing of imminent, irreversible harm, which Consolidated Ridge had failed to demonstrate. She said the denial was written in language that suggested the judge had not been particularly impressed with the motion. She said there was a footnote in the denial that referenced the apparent sophistication of the filing in light of the age of the respondent, which she believed was the judge's way of noting that someone had done their homework. Wren said, "What happens now?" Carol said, "Now Consolidated Ridge has to decide whether to proceed with the underlying title dispute in state court, which will take 18 to 24 months and which they will lose, or to settle. She said they have been served with our counterclaim. The counterclaim names Marcus Webb individually and Ridgeland Advisory as a co-conspirator in a scheme to defraud the estate of Cecil Hollis through manufactured collateral devaluation and bad faith lending practice. The counterclaim also names Consolidated Ridge directly in the title cloud filing as tortious interference with property rights. She said I also filed a referral to the Kentucky Department of Financial Institutions regarding Marcus Webb and the Putnam appraisal arrangement. And my colleague, the former federal prosecutor, filed a referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Louisville regarding the Ridgeland Advisory payment structure. She said Garrett Voss called my office this morning. Wren said, "What did he say?" Carol said he said Consolidated Ridge was prepared to discuss resolution. She paused. She said that is the sound of a company that has realized the field they chose to fight on is not the field they thought it was. Decker came to the property on the first Saturday of November. He came alone without the ram on foot up the lane, which she had not expected. He was wearing the same work coat and the pioneer cap, but there was something different about the way he was carrying himself, a weight in the shoulders that had not been there before, or that she had not been looking for before. She was on the porch with coffee when he came up the lane. He stopped at the foot of the steps. He said, "I talked to a notary in Cumberland yesterday." She waited. He put a folded document on the porch rail. She picked it up. It was an affidavit, 4 pages, stating that to the best of Roy Decker's knowledge and based on historical records made available to him, the true eastern boundary of the Hollis property ran along the line established in the 1934 survey conducted by Thomas Alcott, a distance of 11.3 feet east of the current fence location. It was signed by Roy Decker and notarized by a woman named Patricia Ames of Cumberland, Kentucky, dated November 4th, 2023. He said, "My father made a mistake. I extended that mistake for 36 years. That doesn't make it smaller. She looked at the notarization stamp. She looked at his signature, the careful capital letters of a man who had learned to write on lined paper in a schoolroom and had never moved away from that habit. She said, "I'll file this with the county recorder on Monday." He nodded. He looked out at the south pasture, but the expression on his face was different from the way he had looked at it from the co-op parking lot. There was nothing calculating in it now. It was the look of a man who has put something down that he has been carrying for longer than he can clearly remember, and who is trying to understand what it feels like to walk without it. He said Cecil knew about the East Line. I knew he knew. We never spoke of it directly. He could have filed on me at any time in the last 30 years, and he didn't. Wren said, "I know." Decker said, "Why not?" She thought about it. She said, "I think he was waiting for it to matter to the right person." Decker stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment longer. Then he said, "There's a hydraulic press in my equipment shed. That was your grandfather's originally. He left it with me in 2018 when his barn roof needed work, and I had more space. I should have returned it years ago." She said, "I'll send someone for it." He walked back down the lane. She watched him go. She filed the Decker affidavit with the county recorder on Monday morning. The woman at the counter processed it without expression. Then she looked up and said, "That's going to void their survey injunction filing. You know that?" Wren said she did. The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather came in here every year for 30 years to make sure the tax payments on that south parcel were properly recorded. Every single year, without fail." She pulled at a piece of tape on the edge of the counter. He was a careful man. Wren said yes, he was. The settlement offer from Consolidated Ridge arrived through Carol on November 19th. Carol called her at 7 in the morning and read the terms over the phone. Consolidated Ridge proposed to withdraw the title cloud, filing dismiss all claims related to the south parcel, and make a payment to the Hollis estate of $480,000 in exchange for a full release of all claims against the company, its subsidiaries, and its officers. They also proposed a separate payment of $60,000 to be applied directly to the First Harlan Bank operating note, which would retire the note in full. The total was $540,000. Carol said, "I want to be clear about what this means. They are offering you $540,000 to go away quietly and release them from liability for what they did to your grandfather over 3 years." Wren said, "What do you think it's worth to not go away quietly?" Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The FBI referral is active. The Kentucky DFI investigation of Webb is active. If either of those results in a criminal referral and subsequent prosecution, Consolidated Ridge's exposure multiplies significantly." She paused. She said, "My personal view is that this offer reflects their assessment of that exposure. They are not paying $540 because they feel generous. They are paying $540 because they have lawyers who have told them what discovery in a federal case would cost them." She said, "I recommend you counter." Wren said, "What number?" Carol said, $800,000 full release on the bank note, Consolidated Ridge to cover all estate legal costs, and a clause requiring them to release any and all claims on the south parcel in perpetuity in writing filed with the county. Wren said, "Do it." Carol filed the counter on a Tuesday. Consolidated Ridge responded on Thursday with a revised offer of $680,000 full release on the banknote legal costs, covered the perpetuity clause included. Carol called and read it. There was a pause on the line, not a long one. Wren said yes. The settlement agreement was signed on December 12th, 2023, in Carol Finch's office on Limestone Street in Lexington. Wren drove up the night before in Cecil's truck and stayed in a motel off New Circle Road, the kind with a vending machine in the hallway and a heater that cycled on and off all night. She did not sleep much. Not from anxiety, from the particular alertness of a person who has been moving towards something for a long time and is finally standing at the place where the moving stops. She signed 4 copies of the agreement with Carol beside her, and a paralegal across the table, and a notary at the end. The Consolidated Ridge representatives were present by phone, only their lawyer's voice thin through a conference speaker. When the last signature was done, Carol set her pen down and looked at Wren and said, "Your grandfather would have known what this was worth." Wren said he knew before any of us did. The wire transfer to the estate account cleared on December 14th. Wren sat in the truck in the parking lot of the First Harlan Bank at 9 in the morning on December 15th, with the bank statement pulled up on her phone and the balance showing in a number she had to read 3 times before her eyes would accept it as real. Then she went inside. Marcus Webb was not at his desk. A different woman processed the payment to retire the operating note. She ran the numbers, printed the receipt, stamped it in 2 places, and slid it across the counter with the efficient neutrality of someone who has processed transactions like this before and expects to process them again. The receipt said, Hollis Estate Operating Note, 2006-447, balance retired in full December 15th, 2023. Wren folded it and put it in her coat pocket next to the January 15th foreclosure notice, which she had been carrying since October. She had decided on the drive up from the farm that she would carry both of them until she got home. 31 days before the deadline. Outside in the parking lot, she sat in the truck for a moment and looked at the bank through the windshield. The fluorescent light inside was the same as it had been the first morning she had walked in and told Marcus Webb she would wait. The counter was the same. The chairs were the same. The only thing that had changed was that the note was retired and Webb was not there to slide anything across his desk with 2 fingers. She drove home on Route 421. Marcus Webb resigned from First Harlan Bank on December 20th. The Kentucky Department of Financial Institutions confirmed his resignation in a brief public statement that used the words voluntary separation and ongoing review in the same sentence, which was the institutional way of saying that the review had found what it expected to find, and that the separation had been encouraged rather than chosen. Webb retained a criminal defense attorney in Frankfort the following week, according to Cal Pruitt, who had started sending her occasional texts with county news. Not frequently just the things he thought she ought to know. The FBI investigation was ongoing. Carol said it would be for some time. These things moved on federal timelines and not human ones, but the referral had been accepted, and that was not nothing. It was the kind of thing that sat in a file with a case number and did not go away. Garrett Voss was reassigned to Consolidated Ridge's regional office in Knoxville in January, a lateral move that everyone in the industry understood as the kind of lateral that is also downward. His name came off the Nashville directory. His Nashville office was given to someone whose name she did not recognize and did not need to. Cal told her something else in December that she had not expected. The Putnam appraisal, the one that had manufactured the collateral concern on the Hollis property, had been used on 2 other properties in Harlan County in the previous 4 years. Both properties had eventually sold, one to a private land company, one at a bank foreclosure sale, both at prices below assessed value. Cal had filed a formal complaint with the county commissioners and had CC'd the state attorney general's office. He said he did not know if anything would come of it, but that he had decided that not knowing was no longer a sufficient reason for silence. She paid the property taxes on the south parcel on December 22nd, the first time they had been paid under the Hollis name in 82 years. The county recorder's office processed it without incident. The Boone name came off the tax rolls. The Hollis name went on. It took 11 minutes and cost $43. She drove home in Cecil's truck in the late afternoon light of the shortest week of the year. The ridge to the north was white, along the top where the first real snow had come and held. The south pasture ironweed was brown and flat, under the frost invisible the way it was every winter, waiting under the cold for whatever spring decided to do with it. She had not made a decision about the south field. She had looked at the numbers enough times to know what the anthracite was worth at current market rates. She had spoken to Carol about the legal pathway for developing it herself through a licensed operator rather than selling the rights outright. She had read about what a working anthracite operation did to a piece of ground and to the water table below it, and to the land on either side of it. She had read what the Hollis and Sons ledgers said about what had held the farm together when the corn went for nothing and the banks came calling. It had not been a mine. It had been a shop and a herd, and 40 years of careful work, and a man who fixed other men's equipment for eggs and smoked hams, and the use of a milk cow he had named Clover. She would make the decision in the spring. She had decided that much. She would let the ground thaw, and she would walk the south parcel, the way Harold Finch had walked it in 1969, and the way Willis Hollis had walked it every year before that, and the way Cecil had walked it without ever breaking it open, and then she would decide. Her grandfather had honored his father's promise for 54 years. She did not owe the land 54 years, but she owed it a winter at least. She reopened the shop on January 3rd, 2024. The first job came from Ida Pruitt, who needed a gate latch on the east side of her property. Wren drove over on a Thursday afternoon, measured the post, brought the latch back to the shop, fitted it, drove back and set it on a Friday morning with the temperature at 22 degrees and her breath making small clouds in the still air above the Pruitt fence line. Ida stood in the doorway of her house with her coat pulled across her chest and watched every step of it. When Wren was done, she said, "What do I owe you?" Wren said nothing. Ida said, "I don't take charity." Wren said, "It's not charity. You were the first person who didn't tell me to sell." Ida was quiet for a moment. The cold sat between them, and neither of them moved against it. Then Ida said, "Your grandfather would have liked you." Wren said, "I know." She drove back to the farm on the county road with the heat running, and Pone on the seat, and the January sky white above the ridge and the shop behind her just opened, and the new ledger on the workbench opened to the first page, which she had written herself in the same block letters she had learned from reading her grandfather's hand. January 3rd, 2024. Gate latch repair. Ida Pruitt, east boundary, no charge. She was the first one who didn't laugh. The second ledger entry came the following Tuesday. A fence brace for Dale Minter's Northfield, $12. He paid in cash and did not say much, but he stood in the shop doorway for a long time, looking at the forge the way men of a certain age look at things that have been gone longer than they expected and have come back without asking permission. Before he left, he said, "It smells the same in here." She said, "Good." By the end of January, she had 9 jobs in the book. By the end of February 22, she paid the spring property tax on the full 160 acres, plus the 38 on March 1st, the first time in the history of the Hollis family that all of it had been paid under the same name on the same day. She drove to the county recorder's office herself to confirm the filing. The same woman was at the counter. She processed the payment and stamped the receipt and slid it across the laminate surface. She said, 198 acres Hollis paid in full. Wren took the receipt. She said, 198 acres. The woman said, including the south parcel. That's the total. Wren looked at the receipt. 198 acres. Her name, paid in full. She folded it once and put it in the inside pocket of her grandfather's barn coat against her chest, in the same pocket where she had carried the brass key on the paper tag through the first weeks of October, when she had not yet known whether to trust the things the dead had left her. She walked out into the March light on Central Street in Cumberland, Kentucky. The sky was high and pale, and the ridge line to the east showed the first faint green of something deciding to come back after a long time away. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hand flat against the pocket where the receipt was folded, and breathed the air that smelled of cold limestone and something sweeter, underneath the smell of ground that is about to change its mind about winter. She had not been alone with it, as it turned out. She had been surrounded by it the entire time, the ledgers and the jars and the notebooks and the brass key and the careful handwriting of the people who had known something was coming, long before it arrived, and had left her every tool she would need to meet it if she would only go to the right doors and open them in the right order. The shop still had a loose board on the south side of the roof. She had not fixed it yet. Some things you leave a little while longer, so you remember what it sounded like when you did not know what you were doing, so that when you finally fix them, you understand what you are fixing and why, and the work means what work is supposed to mean. She got in the truck. She drove home on Route 421. The ironweed in the south pasture was still flat and brown and invisible under the last of the frost, the way it was every March, the way it had been every March since 1974, when her grandfather had let it spread, because he said the monarchs needed it more than he needed a clean field. It would be back in 6 weeks. It came back every year. It had been coming back every year before she was born, and it would keep coming back long after she was gone. She pulled into the lane and got out, and Pone came off the porch and walked beside her to the barn, and the day's work opened in front of her, the way it opened every morning now, with the particular texture of a life that belonged to her and to no one else. She was 17 years old. She had 198 acres, a working forge, a blue-tick hound, and a ledger with 22 names in it. She had work to do.